Christmas, everyone. Welcome to our December meeting of the council. Our first order of business will be the approval of the minutes for November 10th, 2015 regular council meeting.
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Minutes stand as approved. At this time, I'd like to recognize outgoing council member Dan Phillips. Dan, can you come forward? I have a plaque for you. Dan, it's been a pleasure serving with you. As I said earlier, we didn't always agree. We bleed friends. I appreciate that. And it's an honor to be elected to serve the town, and you served us well. I wish you nothing but the best. Thank you, sir. Here's a plaque in recognition of your service to the town. Thank you. J.B. Lawrence.
Do solemnly swear that I will support and maintain the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Constitution and laws of the state of North Carolina, and the town of Boyd Rock, not inconsistent therewith, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of mayor to which I have been entrusted without fear or favor, so help me God.
I will. Okay, Jim and Al. Left hand, raise your right hand. Okay. I'll say I. State your name, okay? I
Jim Steele,
do solemnly swear that I will support and maintain the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Constitution and laws of the state of North Carolina, and the town of Boyd Rock, not inconsistent therewith, and that I will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of council member to which I have been entrusted without fear or favor, so help me God.
I do.
Thank you.
Don't break a leg. They say that too.
Be careful at Hinge.
Good. That'd be nice.
Okay, our next order of business will be the selection of Mayor Pro Tem, and I will entertain a motion for a nomination for that position.
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion, go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion that we elect Mayor Pro Tem Albert Yount back.
Okay,
Second.
okay. Any other nominations? Not all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, vote no. Motion carries.
Thank you,
Congratulations.
Do you accept, Albert?
I accept.
Yes, sir. Probably should have asked him for it.
Okay, Kip Turner cannot be here this evening, so Kevin is going to fill in for him.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Here are the notes provided by Kip Turner from the 321 project. After today, all the base layers on 321 will be completed between Sunset Drive and South Main, which means the new road is up to proper elevation for pouring the remaining curb and gutter through this section. A number of concrete driveway aprons have already been poured, but over the next couple of weeks, there will be a heavy focus on pouring the remaining concrete aprons at businesses. NCDOT has been in contact with property owners about specific details of construction and will continue to be as this work progresses. Access will be affected but will be maintained. For instance, no two driveways to the same business will be closed at the same time. In drives with single access where the geometry does not allow the contractor to completely close the entire access, the concrete apron will be poured in two halves, so there will be access for at least a single lane or for at least a single vehicle at all times. Concrete curb and gutter will continue continue to also be placed along the side streets in a couple of weeks, including Church Street and Sunset Drive. Wall construction continues to blow the road on the side opposite of Samaritan's Purse. Expectations are for this wall to be completed within 2 to 2.5 weeks. Once this wall is completed, the underground duct bank can be completed up to Food Line. Available areas to pave will be pursued right behind the work for the duct bank, which must be installed prior to paving. Construction of West Cornish Drive has begun this week, and paving in this intersection will begin towards the end of this week and the first of next. As with the paving operations in Sunset Drive, motorists will be asked to use alternate routes while paving. Construction of the Southern Drive at the Holiday Inn is also expected to be completed over the next week. In an effort to improve communication about work progressing in the business areas, the DOT will be including notes about paving and concrete work around businesses in their morning email and Twitter feeds that are already sent out. An informational handout has also been developed that further describes the driveway construction process. This information is being shared with property owners and is available for anyone with questions about driveway construction. Kip Turner.
Thank you, Kip. Did good. Okay, I overlooked a resolution that I would like to share with you on the naming of the bridge up to Chestnut Ridge. It's a resolution in support of naming the bridge at the entrance of the Foley Center at Chestnut Ridge, a post-acute care facility, the Reba S. and D. Grady Moritz Jr. Bridge. Whereas the town of Blowing Rock's mayor and town council strongly support the naming of the new bridge at the Foley Center at Chestnut Ridge, and whereas the newly constructed two-lane bridge provides entry into the Foley Center at Chestnut Ridge, a post-acute care facility, and whereas Appalachian Regional Healthcare System, with the support of the town of Blowing Rock, wish to name the Foley Center at Chestnut Ridge Bridge in honor of two longtime residents of Watauga County, and whereas Reba and Grady Moritz have made significant contributions to healthcare and the overall community, and whereas Reba and Grady Moritz have also demonstrated a lifetime of support for healthcare, tourism, education, and community building in Blowing Rock and the high country of North Carolina. And now, therefore, be it resolved, the town of Blowing Rock mayor and town council approve the naming of the new bridge at the entrance of the Foley Center at Chestnut Ridge as the Reba S. and D. Grady Moritz Jr. Bridge this 8th day of December 2015. This resolution, actually the naming will be approved by the state, but we need this resolution before we get there. So do I hear a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second? Motion second. Other discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed vote no. The resolution stands approved. Thank you. Okay, Scott, upcoming board and commission appointment process.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. I just wanted to use this opportunity to let folks know about the upcoming vacancies that will become available on our boards and commissions. We have a total of 10 vacancies that will come available by March of 2016. We have 3 planning board vacancies, 2 vacancies on the Board of Adjustment, 2 on the Tourism Development Authority, 2 vacancies on the Blowing Rock Appearance Advisory Commission, and then 1 vacancy on the Alcohol Beverage Control Board. We have information about these vacancies and the boards that involves the work that they do on a link on the top of our website at townofblowingrock.com.
Thank you. Anyone interested, please submit a resume and tell us why you'd like to do that, what you bring to the table, please.
And those are due by January 5th,
January 5th.
2016.
Okay, consent agenda, Scott.
Thank you, Mayor. We have 3 items before you on your consent agenda this evening. Number 1 is a budget ordinance amendment to account for some donations that we have received, $3,000 from the Blowing Rock Community Foundation for the purchase of a golf cart for the police department, $2,500 from the Village Foundation of Blowing Rock, and $500 from the Blowing Rock Community Library, both of those in support of our winter and Christmas lighting program. Our surplus equipment resolution is the second item on the consent agenda. 58 of the chairs, or a total of 58 chairs that used to be in the council chambers, are now available for disposition, and with this particular resolution, we'll proceed and put them on the website GovDeals to the highest bidder. And our third item is a parking update to a conditional use permit that council saw in October. It's 2015-04 for the Moody Building renovation. And the originally approved conditional use permit required that 2 of the newly built parking spaces be reserved as public parking, given that 2 spaces on Sunset were being removed to provide access to the site. This specific provision, as it progressed through the process, was not discussed in detail during either the planning board meeting or the council meeting in which it was approved, even though it was listed in the initial CUP. Given that a total of 21 spaces are being constructed with the project and that this total is providing 14 more spaces than required by the town code, the requirement of having 2 of them reserved as for public parking has been identified for removal, and that summarizes the 3 items on the consent agenda. You can, if that's what you'd like to do.
I actually want to talk about this CUP for Moody's. I don't have anything against the development, I just have some questions.
We'll make a motion to remove that one now.
I make a motion that it be removed.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Further discussion? If not, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. We'll discuss that separately. Do I hear a motion for approval on the other 2 items?
I make a motion we approve the other 2
Okay,
items.
thank you.
Second.
Motion is second. Further discussion? If none, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote no. Motion carries. Okay. Discussion on item number 3. Albert?
There's a lot of talk going around, Mr. Manager, about when we talk about parking places, that hits to the core of a lot of people in town. A lot of people have paid extra money and lots of it for additional parking places. And how about explaining to me what has happened here?
Yeah, this project has evolved for probably the last 1.5 to 2 years, and as various options for access to this site were considered, it was clear that possibly as many as 4 spaces would need to be removed from Sunset to provide 2-way access into the site. Ultimately, the option to try to provide 1-way access to the Moody Building came about through the connection back to the Maple Street public parking lot. So given that there would be 1-way access, the number of public spaces that would be needed to provide that access actually got reduced to 2, realizing that you wouldn't need to remove more spaces because people would be coming out onto Sunset. So that had been identified in discussion early on. Mr. Lovern felt like that was something that the town should bring up through the process. I think we felt like it was something that he could bring up and kind of mention during the process. It was never actually mentioned as a discussion point at the planning board. So then when the CUP document was actually developed, the reservation of 2 spaces that were being removed from Sunset to be reserved in the parking lot was put in the CUP. When that was transmitted to Mr. Lovern, we didn't hear back specifically, so we assumed that was okay. So that's how it transmitted its way to council. Ultimately, when Mr. Lovern got the CUP to sign, he noticed that that was in there, and he felt like, given the number of spaces that he was providing over and above the requirement, with 21 being the calculated need, actually 22 being the calculated proposed use, and giving credit for the 12 that he was using, ultimately he would only be required to add 5 spaces. So he's got a total of 21 spaces in the new parking lot, which by the time you take out the reservations, that's actually 5 spaces credit for the lot, and then 2 that he might have lost on Sunset. He's actually providing 14 more spaces than the code requires. Part of his rationale is that typically, maybe not necessarily today, but typically when people think about parking spaces in front of a business, they think about those spaces ideally being reserved for the business that they're in front of. Obviously, in practical terms, that doesn't always work out. Mr. Lovern felt that given that he was providing so many spaces associated with the building and more than was being required, that was a fair trade-off in and of itself. When Mr. Lovern and I talked about some options, and I asked whether he would actually be signing the private parking spaces to be reserved for, let's imagine, the highest use that he's building the parking spaces for being a restaurant use, so let's call it Moody Restaurant. Reserved for Moody Restaurant parking, all others will be towed. Is that something you plan on putting there? He said it would not be his goal, it would not be his preference to have it there, but as he looks to lease the building out, he couldn't necessarily determine that would forever and ever be non-signed parking. So we talked about other private parking lots in town, and we couldn't think of one that does not have signage to that effect in it. So it's quite possible that ultimately the tenant of that building could want to have it signed accordingly. Now, whether they actually enforce towing on that, that would be up to that individual property owner. So that was kind of the thought process that Mr. Lovern was using given the number of spaces that he's providing over and above the code, 14. He felt like that was a fair trade-off, and he shouldn't have to necessarily reserve those two for public parking. So rather than going back through the planning board and then to council in January, time is becoming of the essence for his schedule of getting engineers and contractors involved. So we thought this might be a good start to get it before council in our quickest mechanism possible, and then kind of go from there. So I'll be happy to answer any follow-up.
As I remember, that was in the CUP when I read it.
It was, and
So
that.
when we approved it to have those two spaces.
Right, and we thought that Mr. Lovern was on board with that sentence being in there, and as it turns out, he was not.
So if he's the developer in a restaurant, and I think it wasn't just restaurants, he's thinking of retail in there was the other thing.
I think restaurant was the most intense parking use, which is why he went for that number of spaces. It may be retail ultimately.
So if somebody goes in there with a restaurant, can they say you can't park here
They would be within their rights to do that.
except for the two spaces?
Well, that's where it brings us back to the CUP. I think Mr. Lovern's preference would be not to have them reserved for the public and just let it be the parking that it is.
And didn't he say that it was also gonna be the parking for because he owns the buildings on Main Street, so the businesses there were also gonna park there, is that not?
He was gonna have, of the 21, I think 6 reserved for either the residences or the retail businesses there. Yes,
So that gets us down to 15.
right, so those would likely be signed accordingly, I would imagine.
So for the restaurant, he needs 14?
He is actually, for the, per code, 5 spaces for the restaurant. After you back out all the credits, he only needs to add 5 spaces. So then he wants to use 6 of the spaces for the tenants and the off-site apartments. So that would be 11, but he's actually building 21 spaces. So he's got a net of 10 extra, quote unquote.
So how much does the restaurant require?
The
I didn't
restaurant
remember that.
requires 22 spaces.
Requires 5.
A total of 22, but by the time you back all out the credits, yes, he needs to build 5
What
spaces.
credits are you talking about?
This is for the warehouse, the 3,700 square feet warehouse, the garage, and the house. You got a credit of 12 spaces for
Oh, what they
those.
tore down,
Right.
okay. How are y'all feeling?
I'm fine with taking it out. There'd be no way to police that. I mean, if somebody have to stand there all day long, are you going in the restaurant? That would be just impossible.
There are a variety of spaces. I might ask Kevin, who's got a little bit more history and background, to come help about where the various parking spaces are.
I think right now they park beside the Moody Building in the side gravel area. Either they park there or the tenants that rent the units above Final Touches, they park there. And so by building this parking lot, he'll have a place for them to park, and he's designating 6 spaces for them.
So that's the Nico.
Nico and
Yeah.
Pat.
What about the ones that are going down Main Street, like toward Ragged Garden? Where do they park? Do they park behind their buildings and come in the back?
I don't know. Some might park on the street. I would imagine some park on the street. And others park, there's about 3 parking spaces behind those buildings, that's it.
That's it. Well, except they can't park over 3 hours.
A lot of them use Maple Street.
Maple Street parking
Yeah,
lot.
they use Maple Street.
Especially this time.
Maple lot.
Yeah.
So how do we rectify this, since we've already approved it?
Well, that's why it's back before you. We didn't feel like staff had the authority to make the change in the conditional use permit as council initially approved it. So it's back before you to strike number 6 out of the initial CUP and then adjust the numbers in number 7, so that it would effectively take out the impact of having to reserve those 2 spaces as public parking. The way it was worded, it didn't say they had to be signed as public parking, but that's kind of the inference that to reserve them, you would have to somehow designate them as public parking.
So theoretically, if his leaseholder, if he has one, could say, no public parking in here, only my restaurant clients can park here, we have lost 2 parking places. That's theory.
Theory,
Then-
2 public spaces,
Then you
that's
have
right.
to look at it, okay, here's a new project versus the leaseholder might not do that, so that's where I am with it. I'm not opposed to it, I'm saying, I hope we get this straightened out this time and we don't have to do this anymore. Okay?
Yes, sir.
But even if it was designated public parking, they can park there and go in the restaurant.
I understand,
You
yeah.
know, it's no different than parking out on the street and public parking and going in the restaurant.
Well, okay, I understand.
You know.
I just wanted to get this out and us talk about it.
Sure.
It's my whole thrust.
By the way, I can't vote on this.
Okay. What's your pleasure?
I want to know if anybody in the audience wants to say anything. Okay?
I won't say anything anyway.
No, I move it be approved.
Okay. Have a motion for approval. Is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? If not, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, vote no. Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, presentation of the audit. Nicole.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council. I'm pleased to announce that the fiscal year 2015 audit has been submitted to the Local Government Commission and approved. Here tonight to present the audit are our auditing firm, Combs, Tennant and Carpenter, PC, and we have Jason Carpenter and Brady Combs here to give the presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to them.
section, in the third column over, you'll see $233,953 as a net pension asset. Down a few lines, you'll see a bold heading of deferred outflows of resources, and the subheading is contributions to the pension plan in the current fiscal year, with a total deferred outflows of $152,000. And then down about 6 lines up from the bottom, you'll see deferred inflows of resources, pension deferrals. Only pulling all this out is a new pronouncement of the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB 68, that required the town to implement this new standard that takes the assets and liabilities and equity of the North Carolina local government retiree system and takes a proportionate share of the town of Blowing Rock and put it back on your books. And so that's kind of what this did. I'm not going to get into the effect of it because I don't think it's anything that is meaningful to you as a town council as far as your budgeting purposes and that thing, but I just wanted you to know that that's something that Nicole and the staff had to do this year. And there's about 6 to 8 pages of additional disclosure back in the notes and required supplementary information. If you want to take a look at it and dig a little further into what all that new pronouncement means, it's there. Next, I'll direct your attention to page 18. Page 18 is the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance for the governmental funds of the town. I'll direct your attention to the leftmost column, the general fund, your operating fund of the town. And if you'll go to the 4th line up from the bottom, you'll see net change in fund balances, $1,581,715. That's added to fund balance this year, but in pointing that fact out, I'd like to go 2 lines above that, and you'll see that $1,566,436 of that were from borrowings to handle capital projects. So if you take those borrowings out, your actual inflows and outflows in operating the town, you about broke even. So we didn't add a whole lot to fund balance other than debt proceeds that are reserved. Now, if you'll flip back 1 page to page 17, again in the leftmost column, you'll see the general fund. This statement is the balance sheet of the governmental funds, and it shows your cash, your receivables, your payables, and your equity. And I'll direct your attention to the bottom to total fund balances in that leftmost column. It's two rows up, $5,057,048. Of that total fund balance, your unassigned fund balance is $2,330,903. That's about 39.7% of your general fund expenditures this year. It's a council policy, it's a town policy that we have here to try to keep about 50% of our fund balance unassigned, 50% of those expenditures unassigned for the year. And you'll see that this year we are at 39.7. We're used to being at around 50 to 51%. And I'd like to share with you that the reason for that is there's $691,000 up in the assets section due from other funds. And if you'll look down in the liabilities section, 1 column over in the capital projects fund, there's $691,000 due back to the general fund. Well, accounting pronouncements, the LGC and the laws that speak to what is unassigned fund balance, that says anything that's due to you is not unassigned. It's assigned fund balance, and you can't use that to budget for in the subsequent year. But I'll share with you that
Jason.
I'll entertain any questions.
Jason, the debt ratio, as we've acquired this a little bit more, do you see any problem there at all?
No, I think you're well below your legal debt margin right now. And so I don't see any problems with that. You've got the bond issues coming up this year, and that's gonna be a big thing. You'll probably see some changes in your financial statements this year. And that, to mention that, that's another thing that Nicole and Scott and their staff did this year. In addition to keeping up with $8 million that run through the town, they prepared all the financial information and got that bond referendum done as well.
Do you feel comfortable that we've got enough coming in to take care of everything we've got going out?
From what we can see here, I do, sir.
Any other questions? Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Brady.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and your staff. Good job.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Always good to have a good financial report.
Way to go, Sharon.
Landscape buffer width considerations. Kevin.
I want to give you a brief report on what we discussed last month with the planning board regarding landscape ordinance. At a recent meeting, town council suggested that staff and planning board evaluate the landscape screening standards in the land use code and how they might apply to various projects. Over the past few months, planning board and town council have reviewed two separate projects that have requested waivers of the applicable landscape screening standard. The first project was for the Blowing Rock Urgent Care, in which an existing buffer along the adjacent Subway restaurant property met the buffer width and plant material for that property. The ordinance, as currently written, also requires an additional 8-foot buffer on the urgent care property. There's not sufficient space to provide the additional buffer and maintain the existing parking spaces, so the waiver was granted to allow the urgent care project to not install the additional buffer. At the November meeting, staff presented to the planning board, for discussion purposes only, a draft ordinance amendment to section 16-22.7 that would have allowed an existing buffer between two similar classification uses to satisfy the screening requirements between those uses without having to provide additional width. Ultimately, after discussion on this draft amendment, the planning board unanimously agreed that there was sufficient flexibility in the land use code to handle buffer issues similar to the urgent care project and treat those on a case-by-case basis. The second project requested landscape buffer waiver was for the Ransom Street duplex project. The side buffer requirement is to provide a 16-foot wide screening between the duplex building and the adjacent single-family structures. There's not enough room to provide a full 16-foot wide buffer, and the required side setback is only 8 feet. The waiver was ultimately approved for an 8-foot wide semi-opaque buffer. Staff presented to the planning board, again for their discussion purposes, a draft ordinance which would have amended the type of screening between classification 2 uses, which is duplexes, multifamily, recreation, churches, etc., and class 1 uses, single-family homes. And we wanted to reduce that from 16 feet to 8 feet. After discussion and consideration, the planning board agreed that the buffer width of 16 feet, as required, was more desirable, and that the flexibility provided in the land use code was the best way to alter the landscape buffer widths as each project is reviewed, again on a case-by-case basis. Attached in your packet was the minutes from the November 9th planning board meeting, and I believe the staff report was also in there, and the summary draft ordinance. David Harwood, our planning board chair, is here to share a couple of comments on the decision by the planning.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council. Thank you, Kevin. First, I want to thank Kevin and Tammy. They did the heavy lifting on this research as usual. They did come up, we're looking at 2 things. One, reducing landscape buffers between, well, we took the project owner, Kevin took the project owner. There were 2 things that they suggested where we could make changes. One was reducing the buffer between similar classifications, which was the case at the urgent care, between urgent care and Subway. The other was reducing landscape buffers between classification 1 and classification 2, which was the situation with the duplexes on Ransom Street. And there was actually a third project, the Moody Building, where we had a similar situation. So we had 3 projects kind of back to back to back where we reduced these landscape buffers. I think that prompted council to ask us to take a look at it. In each of those cases, we felt that the merits of the individual projects warranted reducing these buffers. For instance, on Ransom Street, it wasn't necessarily a reduction from 16 to 8 because that buffer width varied from 14 to 8. So it was more of an average there that we were taking. There were a number of things with the 2014 comprehensive plan that project achieved for the town. So a lot of these things we took into consideration and felt that they were worthy of reducing these landscape buffers. Also at each of those meetings, we did not have anybody from the public that came and objected to these, with the exception of the Moody Building, let me make that clear. But we felt that the way the code is currently was more than adequate, and that the board felt that we should leave it alone. It was well-written, and that we want to have the ability to review this on a case-by-case basis. And that would be our recommendation to you, is to take no action on this. Any questions?
No, thank you for your hard work on this, you and the rest, other members of the planning board. Okay, sidewalk to Bass Lake federal grant process approval for next steps. Scott?
Thank you, Mayor. We never want to say we've got it before we've really got it, but we've got a good chance. We've been notified, this is the Federal Lands Access Program grant that would pay for about 80% of the $1.2 million project to take a sidewalk along 221 from Main Street out to the entrance to Bass Lake. So it's a very promising step. What we've been asked to do is complete our portion of a memorandum of agreement that would be with the federal government, the Parkway, the NCDOT. It will be routed around from the various agency perspectives, finalized, and then brought back before you for a final agreement. One of the things we're working on now is what that project schedule will look like and how the funding will flow and the various pieces of that. So once everybody kind of looks at it from all the participating agencies, we'll bring it back before you. But this is really just to notify you and the public that so far so good in this approval process, and looking for your approval that we're still interested in moving forward and completing that next step in the process.
I think it's wonderful.
Good news.
Let's continue.
Good news.
You got a time frame for the whole
Well,
ball of wax?
we're hoping that the memorandum of agreement will be finalized sometime in January. That's the first step in the process. So we'll likely be back before you in January, if not February.
Scott, where are we gonna get the $250,000 that we have to come up with?
This particular project was actually included as part of the bond referendum,
Okay.
and it was included in the third phase. So we may need to adjust the timing depending on this project
Okay,
schedule.
but it's in the bond.
Yes, sir.
It's in, okay.
Was the entire amount in the bond?
Yes.
So,
We had $1,226,000 in the third phase of the bond referendum for this, so it'll free up a little more than
Good, so we got
$980,000.
some dough till we can do some other things.
Absolutely.
We
Bingo,
get it.
Almost $1
We
million.
get it, yeah. It's our hope.
bingo.
I think we can find a use for it.
I appreciate a lot of the hard work you put in there, because I know this sending this back in is considered a lot of paperwork from what I
Yeah.
saw that you had to do. So
Yeah, thank you.
I know
like
it's been
4
a lot of
more
work to
hoops.
this project.
We'll do a lot of paperwork for $980,000, right?
Good.
Okay. Anything else?
I just want to thank the planning board for their recommendation on that. Thanks for doing that.
I just want to say, David, I'm the guy that stirred all that up. And I did it in the interest of oversight. And, the Congress battles over oversight every 2 or 3 years. You guys do a great job, and I concur.
Thank you.
Sharon, do we have any speakers from the floor? Anything else for the good of the cause? Not? Have a Merry Christmas.
Merry
Thanks for
Christmas,
being here.
everybody.